I'd just like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Vanessa Wills, is Associate Professor of Philosophy at GW, George Washington University, previously taught at St. Joseph's, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And was a visiting faculty fellow at UMBC, which is University of Maryland, Baltimore County, at the Drescher Center for Humanities, and a DAAD visiting chair in ethics in Munich, the Munich Center for Ethics. She has recently published a book with Oxford called Marx's Ethical Vision. So definitely a fellow traveler. And for your interest, she started at the University of Pittsburgh, where she wasn't able to find a big center for Marxist studies, but managed to do her dissertation on that. In any case, working with some of the faculty there, and as well as a couple of outsiders, including Tommy Shelby, who gave one of our previous talks. So the new book she's working on is called Black Women Marxists on Race, Gender, and Class. And that's just something to look forward to because it's just underway. And we're really delighted to have her talk today on who has human rights, liberal consensus, left critique, and far-right authoritarian crisis. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for having me and for that really warm and welcoming introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the collective efforts of the Ralph Bunche Center and Philosophy and Map in bringing me here. So I'm going to kind of just get right into it. So recent events have caused me to return to a question that I first began thinking about, fairly early, and then sort of set to the side. And that's just the question of human rights, of how to make sense of human rights talk, how to make sense of human rights practice, how to make sense of a theory and set of concepts that that one might expect to encapsulate some of our highest and dearest aspirations for how we want to treat one another as human beings and what kinds of flourishing human lives we hope for our institutions to support. But the reality is often quite different, where we see human rights talk invoked to justify the most horrific abuses, all the way up to and including the physical destruction of human beings en masse. So I want to set there's a few things I want to do today. I want to first set the stage with some events of 2003 that I hope will help sort of focus the question. And then I want to invite you to come along with me through discussion of various human rights theorists' attempts to give some kind of rich philosophical underpinning to the notion of human rights. And what I hope to make seem plausible, I don't know that I have a knockdown argument for it yet, I'm working on it. What I hope to make seem very plausible is that the most broadly held conceptions of human rights that we see deployed by powerful nation states and by the UN and by other institutions of that sort, that they're bad, that they and that they're bad, and they're bad in ways that causes the practice or at least the talk, let's say, to sort of collapse into the same kind of rather naive relativism that human rights is supposed to be, in part, a bulwark against, right? It's supposed to be saying, no, there are things that are universally wrong. And then I, at the very end, I am, surprise, surprise, going to suggest that maybe Marxism has something to offer that might help us to to organize our social justice efforts in a way that isn't so readily made use of by forces of destruction, right, of killing. So in May 2023, a UN special rapporteur, Fiona Nealon, visited Guantanamo Bay. And this was historic for many reasons. Chief among them, it was the first UN visit to Guantanamo. So the Biden administration was the first administration to allow anyone in. Now, of course, by the time that she was there were about 30 prisoners left. So this is not at the height of the abuses, right? But it was notable. And she gave a press conference and was asked the question by a reporter from Arab News Daily. He said, the Guantanamo Bay facilities have always been used around the world against the United States. Whenever the United States calls out the government for prison torture, for all those things, they use Guantanamo as, you know, the dark spot on the US. How much do you think maintaining those facilities affects the credibility of the United States when it champions human rights issues around the world? And Alon answered as follows. Some of these quotes at the beginning are going to be a bit meaty, but so she says, one of the things I'd say is that this report is clearly a commitment to de-exceptionalize Guantanamo. And I welcome that because it matters that states take responsibility for their serious violations of international law. It matters that UN special experts, human rights experts have access to even the most high secure places. If one state creates an exceptional zone, then every state can create an exceptional zone. And the fundamental point of this visit is that exceptionalization. But let me also be clear, a visit doesn't take away from the ongoing responsibilities. In having allowed my team and I to visit this detention facility, we have scrutinized every aspect of the detention facility, from the standard operating procedures to the use of numbers rather than names for the men who are detained there, from shackling to forced cell extractions, to the quality of medical care, to the absence of holistic torture rehabilitation, to lack of access to family and treatment. These are all serious matters that the US has now a set of practical recommendations in its hands to remedy those things. I strongly encourage their adoption. I would also say to other member states who do not allow access to other sites of detention, the precedent of non-access to Guantanamo has now been broken. So other states should expect that UN human rights experts would rightly have access to other places of detention. So that's in May 2003, and throughout this press conference, she's guardedly optimistic, right, that this that the allowing of access represents a pivot point, that perhaps the US is going to take more seriously the notion of setting an example, right, living up to its own ideals and its own conception of itself as a promoter, a champion of human rights, rather than one of the leaders in violating human rights. And that doesn't happen, of course, because later that same year, the US accelerates its support for the violence and destruction inflicted on the people of Gaza by the state of Israel, right? And it's sending bombs and money. I want to, this is the second half of this sort of initial stage setting, right, of the sort of contemporary situation. I just want to read to you A passage from an article written by two surgeons, Feroza Sidwa and Mark Perlmutter, who visited Gaza and reported back on their findings. And so they say the following: no amount of medical care could ever compensate for the damage being inflicted here. As humanitarian trauma surgeons, we have both seen incredible suffering. Collectively, we were present at ground zero on 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the 2010 earthquake in Haiti on the first day of these disasters. We have worked in the deprivation of southern Zimbabwe and the horrors of the war in Ukraine. Together, we have worked on more than 40 surgical missions in developing countries on 3 continents in our combined 57 years of volunteering. This long experience taught us there was no greater pain as a humanitarian surgeon than being unable to provide needed care to a patient. But that was before we came to Gaza. Now we know the pain of being unable to treat a child who will slowly die, but also alone, because she is the only surviving member of an entire extended family. We have not had the heart to tell these children how their families died. Burned, shredded to pieces, entombed in their apartment buildings to die slowly of asphyxia and sepsis. So I present those two sort of cases, right? As I say, to set the stage a bit for what our contemporary moment is. But beyond that, there's also a growing threat of right-wing authoritarianism all around the world. We see it, including in the US, famously, right? And when I began to think about these questions about human rights, the thought was, look at how these supposedly liberal democratic states uphold the notion of human rights in principle, in word, but not in deed. And perhaps what's needed then is a left criticism, a left challenge, right, to the ways that human rights talk can lend itself to these kinds of uses and abuses. But the circumstance right now is worse than that, right? Because we have a scenario where increasingly we're seeing that the states that even profess some sort of liberalism are moving closer and closer, right, to a very far-right, authoritarian, complete rejection of the idea that anybody would be entitled to anything at all. Yeah, and with some of the most horrifying examples being well known, like to say that Palestinians are human animals, right? So not really worthy of human rights at all. So that's the stage setting stuff. And so I want to move now into the argument. So the question, right? Is there actually an argument to be made for the view that each human being possesses a set of entitlements, rights, totally irrespective of their social, historical, and political circumstances? We often go on as though the answer to this question is obvious and affirmative, but of course that hasn't always been the case, and there's been a lot of debate about this. Traditionally, the question has been answered by appeal to a conception of human rights as natural rights, rights that humans possess just in virtue of being members of the species Homo sapiens. The 1770s, or let's say human, right? The 1776 American Declaration of Independence and the 1789 French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen both profess this doctrine, claiming not to grant, but simply to recognize and uphold natural human right, endowed in human beings by a creator. While this religious backstory provides a metaphysical framework that makes human rights intelligible, we have them because God gave them to us. Obviously, there's all sorts of objections and reasons that that is not going to serve the purposes of contemporary human rights discourse. Additionally, that theological grounding for human rights is in tension with the role that contemporary human rights talk aspires to play in modern international relations among groups with conflicting religious, political, and ethical traditions. For claims based on human rights to achieve broad assent in this context, they must be claims that peoples in vastly different societies can rationally accept. So recognizing this, the vast majority of today's proponents of human rights jettison the conception of human rights as God-given rights. But I think that this introduces a kind of dilemma. The one horn of that dilemma is that to preserve its traditional ontological grounding in divine authority bars it from candidacy for widespread international acceptance. And that's, of course, problematic because that broad acceptance is what makes human rights talk useful at all for engaging in public discourse and formulating norms about the universal desirability of goods, such as freedom, equality, or human development. The second horn is that without such a theological grounding, it becomes quite daunting to explain what the ontological basis for human rights might be. Motivating that picture calls for significant metaphysical heavy lifting. Human rights are supposed to be extraordinarily robust. Humans have them in any historical time and place, and within or without any society. They are impervious to adjustment or abridgment through human action. If they exist, then they sometimes justify humanitarian, so you can't see the scare quotes, so I'll do it, right. So justify humanitarian interventions and even full-scale wars. But the attempt to provide an acceptable ontological explanation for such rights enjoys not much more success today than it did in 1796, when Jeremy Bentham famously dismissed the Human Rights Project as so much, quote, nonsense upon stilts. But not everyone agrees that this lack of firm ontological foundations for modern day human rights really presents a problem. When the philosopher Charles Bates reports that a member of the UNESCO Committee on the Theoretical Bases of Human Rights admitted that, quote, we agree about the rights, but on condition that no one asks us why. This is a direct quote, right? So one gets the sense that this state of affairs perhaps elicits a self-deprecating chuckle or two, but not any real angst. Like, I mean, he doesn't seem bothered about it, right? So on that view, human rights talk is perfectly suited to the task of public cross-cultural discourse, precisely because it comes with no ontological baggage of its own. So the one aim that I have here is to motivate the thought that we should be a little bit more angst-ridden about that state of affairs. And obviously, I'm not the first to think so. If there's been increasing sort of discussion about human rights talk, it's due in no small part, right, to the shaky philosophical ground upon which they stand. I further suspect that these naturalist, so we might address that issue by saying, great, we need a naturalist conception then, right? So the non-naturalist one, maybe, as I will try to motivate, maybe that is susceptible to relativism in ways that the theory claims to be resistant to it. Maybe we are concerned about the sort of, I'm going to use the word unscientific, right? Kind of lack of underpinning for it. So then maybe what we want is a naturalistic conception of human rights, one that does try to make some claim about what human beings are, and then on the basis of that, make claims about what they're entitled to, and those entitlements taking the form of human rights. But I think there's problems for that too. I'll tell you what they are. So let's start though with non-naturalism. So if human rights seem to require a great deal of the metaphysical heavy lifting, as I noted earlier, then non-naturalism about human rights is one attempt to lighten that load. It's a way of saying what is good for human beings without committing oneself to any particular vision of what human beings are. I focus here on one of the more plausible recent presentations, relatively recent presentations, of a non-naturalist theory of human rights, and that's Charles Beitz's practical conception. In his 2009 book, The Idea of Human Rights, Beitz advances a theme from John Rawls in Rawls's The Law of Peoples. Rawls rejects the project of deriving human rights from, quote, a theological, philosophical, or moral conception of the nature of the human person. One of Rawls's central aims is to formulate what he calls a public conception of human rights that both liberal and some illiberal societies could share. Rawls writes the following: human rights do not depend on any particular comprehensive religious doctrine or philosophical doctrine of human nature. The Law of Peoples does not say, for example, that human beings are moral persons and have equal worth in the eye of God, or that they have certain moral and intellectual powers that entitle them to these rights. To argue in these ways would involve religious or philosophical doctrines that many decent hierarchical peoples might reject as liberal or democratic, or as in some way distinctive of Western political tradition and prejudicial to other cultures. So despite his place, he's famously liberal democratic, right? But Rawls puts forward what here, right, is a relatively thin and conservative conception of human rights. It certainly bears only the most passing resemblance to the revolutionary 18th century doctrine that Bentham, in his writing Anarchical Fallacies, feared would, quote, plant and cultivate a propensity to perpetual insurrection in time future. If human rights ever seem to have an inherently progressive and even potentially revolutionary character, here they are divorced from the types of claims about human persons that could call into question, much less threaten to undermine, many or anti-democratic social arrangements. Beitz agrees with Rawls that human rights theorists need not concern themselves with theorizing an ontological basis for human rights. Developing Rawls's picture, Beitz promotes what he calls a practical approach, arguing that, quote, we do better to approach human rights practically, not as the application of an independent philosophical idea to the international realm, but as a political doctrine constructed to play a certain role in global political life. The important questions to ask then pertain not to the philosophical justifications of human rights as such, but rather to whether human rights-based discourse gives states and humanitarian organizations the ideological tools required to achieve the moral and political aims they take to be worth realizing. This practical conception takes, quote, the functional role of human rights in international discourse and practice as basic. It constrains our conception of a human right from the start, end quote. In other words, for Beitz, we cannot get into the business of determining what human rights are, how the spectrum of human rights is properly delimited, or whether human rights, assuming they exist, should be promoted at all, unless and until we take full stock of how human rights policy is devised and implemented, and whether it suits the purposes of those practitioners. Here, philosophy allows realpolitik to take the lead and set the theoretical agenda. Beitz calls this fixing the function and content of human rights discursively, and its purported correctness is an insight that he again traces back to Rawls. And Beitz writes, this insight, as I've described it, is that we might frame our understanding of the idea of a human right by identifying the roles this idea plays within a discursive practice. We attend to the practical inferences that would be drawn by competent participants in the practice from what they regard as valid claims of human rights. An inventory of these inferences generates a view of the discursive functions of human rights, and this informs an account of the meaning of the concept. So the view is non-naturalistic in the sense that it relies on no particular conception of human nature. So it seems to avoid the dilemma that plagued natural rights. It is neither committed to one untenable or controversial story about the nature of human beings or the ontological basis of their rights, nor do its proponents have the unenviable task of painting an ontological picture both thin and inoffensive enough to draw broad assent, yet robust enough to explain how human beings could have rights that are inalienable, theirs irrespective of what society they are members of, and so on. There's something appealing, of course, right, about inviting philosophers to proceed from the point of taking stock of the empirical facts about already existing human rights practice. And certainly we should agree that theorizing about human rights cannot be done entirely in abstracto. However, I think that this approach relegates philosophy to far too small a role, which is a hell of a thing for a philosopher to say. Of course, I use most things relegate philosophy to too small a role, but human rights make a claim to universality. They are supposed to apply not just to those who debate and set policy, but to every human being, even to those who are unaware of the practice or who reject it outright. It's far from plain to see how, by restricting ourselves to considering human rights within the context of present-day international diplomacy and policymaking, we could derive truly general claims about the rights all human beings have, people well outside that discursive practice included. So in other words, my worry is who's partaking in that discourse, right? When we say, well, let's look at how the rights are already being invoked and used. There's lots of people who are not engaged in those conversations, and yet to whom we think the rights apply. And so I worry that the method here is not actually going to yield the kind of universality that human rights discourse claims to have. So, but the problem is not peculiar to BITES. I think any non-naturalistic conception of human rights faces an insurmountable climb between itself and universality, because a totalizing conception, and here's the mark, right? To totalize it, right? You get a totalizing conception of what human beings are. I don't think totalizing is a dirty word, right? And of the conditions that are common to their existence is precisely what is needed in order to ground a universal morality. I take it that this is a significant reason to rule such conceptions out as good partners for moral universalism. They weaken the case for the possibility of genuinely objective moral knowledge and create the space for skepticism and relativism. This will be made clearer in the following section. And what I want to do there is gloss a kind of cultural, I'm not a relativist, but I want to gloss a cultural relativist critique of human rights. And without endorsing that critique, suggest that it might be worryingly stronger than many human rights proponents acknowledge. So, cultural relativism has been a thorn in the side of modern day human rights theory, at least since the formulation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Man in the mid-1940s. In 1947, the American Anthropological Association issued an official statement of protest. They argued that the Human Rights Project was doomed from the start because, quote, ideas of right and wrong, good and evil are found in all societies, though they differ in their expression among different peoples. What is held to be a human right in one society may be regarded as antisocial by another people or by the same people in a different period of their history. The rights of man in the 20th century cannot be circumscribed by the standards of any single culture or be dictated by the aspirations of any single people. Such a document will lead to frustration, not realization of the personalities of vast numbers of human beings, end quote. So let's make sure, do I have about 20 minutes left? Is that right? Or, okay, great, thank you. So that kind of relativist position or one in the ballpark of it. There was a kind of resurgence of this sort of critique in the 1990s. Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew promoted a set of what he called Asian values, giving pride of place to security and stability over freedom and autonomy. Now, the position was not necessarily a sterling example of philosophical rigor, right? But for Lee, Asian or Western values were to be judged solely on the basis of their usefulness in promoting capitalist economic growth. So in a way, at least it was an honest one, right? Lee's promotion of what he called Asian values brought the issue of relativism to prominence, and it drew responses from philosophers including Amartya Sen, Fred Dallmayr. And since then, of course, a range of voices around the globe have continued to charge that human rights are a form of cultural imperialism imposed upon the global East and South by the global North and West. The discussion has broadened from one of the relationship between Asian values and human rights to include considerations about Islamic values, African values, and so on. Such relativism goes hand in hand with the rejection of the view that there is such a thing as human nature. It is a theoretical inoculation against what one commentator has colorfully referred to as, quote, the virus of essentialism, which I'm here to give you. It is not possible, some relativists will argue, to make universal claims about what ought to be the case for human beings, because it is not possible to make universal claims about what human beings are. According to them, the development of culture as a vast and diverse array of socially produced forms of life has so transformed human beings in such wildly divergent ways that it is a fool's errand to attempt to identify morally significant features that are common among them. Now, whatever else one might think of anti-essentialism about human nature, it seems clear that non-naturalists about human rights must allow that it might be true. And the virtue of non-naturalistic theories of human rights is supposed to be that they commit one to no particular view about human nature and also rule out no such views. But if it is granted that human beings have nothing morally significant in common, no inner core, as the anti-essentialist and cultural relativist might put it, then the question arises, how is it, which is a refrain throughout this talk, how is it possible then to make any moral claims about human beings as a whole, especially if it is true, and it seems at least plausible, that human life is so various and so diverse that even bringing it into the kind of discourse is not necessarily going to yield this sort of universal, objective, widely embraced, right, conception of human rights that human rights proponents are after. So the ways in which those human rights claims pretend to objectivity and universality would be reduced to just that, pretensions. One way out of the problem is to be Richard Rorty. So Rorty embraces the anti-essentialist picture, but stops well short of a cultural relativism that would entail any kind of moral relativism. He simply just flatly insists on the genuine superiority of Western human rights culture, right? That's one way to not be a relativist. So Rorty writes, I quite agree that ours, and he's talking about Western human rights culture. So he says, I quite agree that ours is morally superior, but I do not think this superiority counts in favor of the existence of a universal human nature. We see our task as a matter of making our own culture, the human rights culture, more self-conscious and more powerful, rather than of demonstrating its superiority to other cultures by an appeal to something transcultural, right? So, okay, so it's not relativism, but it's not really what people usually mean by moral universalism either, right? Rorty seems simply to be endorsing the myopia of a particular cultural perspective and just being really like enthusiastic about it. But human rights proponents should be dissatisfied by this. Taking a route like that would mean that human rights, when imposed upon non-rights-based cultures, really do collapse into the unjustified moral imperialism that cultural relativists accuse them of peddling. So non-naturalists about human rights will have to find a different way out, I think. So I have more to say about that, which you can ask me about in Q&A, but I want to move to thinking about an example of a naturalistic approach to human rights, a contemporary example of one. So Martha Nussbaum defends a naturalistic theory of human rights based upon her capabilities approach to setting goals for and measuring the progress of human development. And her ideas have, of course, won significant influence within the United Nations and among human rights organizations worldwide. For Nussbaum, the moral evaluation of societies is rooted in what they allow their members to do and to be. Human rights talk, according to Nussbaum, provides added value to the capabilities approach. As opposed to merely directing attention to the types of functionings human beings can and or ought to be able to execute, Nussbaum writes, to say, here is a list of fundamental rights is more rhetorically direct. It tells people right away that we are dealing with an especially urgent set of functions, backed up by a sense of the justified claim that all human beings have to such things by virtue of being human. In her 2000 book, Women in Human Development, Nussbaum writes, if we have the language of capabilities, do we also need the language of rights? In the sentence, A has a right to have the basic political liberties secured to her by her government, it reminds us that people have justified and urgent claims to certain types of treatment, no matter what the world around them has done about that. I have suggested that this role of rights language lies very close to the ethical role of what I have called basic capabilities, in the sense that the justification for saying that people have such natural rights usually proceeds by pointing to some capability-like feature of persons that they actually have on at least a rudimentary level. And Nussbaum continues, I actually think that without such a justification, right, rooted in a conception of what human beings are, or at least what capabilities they have, she says, without such a justification, the appeal to rights is quite mysterious. On the other hand, there is no doubt that one might recognize the basic capabilities of people and yet still deny that this entails that they have rights in the sense of justified claims to certain types of treatment. Rights language indicates that we do have an argument for why people are entitled to this treatment, and that we draw strong normative conclusions from the fact of the basic capabilities. So the appeal to the broadly used language of rights expediently solves the difficulty of demonstrating the connection between indicative and normative claims. But put in the terms of the above passage from Nussbaum, human rights talk does not actually seem to operate as an ontologically grounded system of universal moral claims, but more like a signal uttered at the correct times to elicit the desired responses from those who, as Nussbaum anticipates, might deny that certain capabilities entail certain rights. Now, Nussbaum might, of course, respond that this is too uncharitable, for she takes herself to have an ethical argument in favor of providing human beings with conditions conducive to the free exercise of their capabilities. But the ethical argument in question is not itself an argument for natural human rights as Nussbaum defines them, entitlements humans have just in virtue of being human. Of Nussbaum's list of 10 central capabilities that she takes human beings to share, none can be understood apart from an accounting of the historical progression, current state, and future trajectory of human social development. So in other words, it's not merely being a member of the species, but various kinds of socially produced relations between people over time. The point is most clear, and I mean, it's most stunningly clear, of course, in the case of a capability such as affiliation, right? Which Nussbaum defines in part as having, quote, having the social bases of self-respect and non-humiliation, and which she argues, quote, entails provisions of non-discrimination on the basis of race, sex, sexual orientation, ethnicity, caste, religion, national origin, and species. As Nussbaum avoids positing any theory of human nature that would describe human existence at a level more ontologically fundamental than the capabilities themselves, I think that she lacks the resources there to tell us in what sense simply being a member of the species Homo sapiens entitles one to, for instance, freedom from religious oppression. She might insist that merely having the capability to affiliate entitles one to conditions in which one may affiliate or not freely. However, this is a socially produced capability that humans have not just in virtue of being human, but because they are humans living in certain types of societies at certain stages of social development. A human living in complete isolation from other human beings lacks the capability of affiliation, and not just because he is alone. If he were introduced to other humans, a long and difficult process of socialization would have to be undertaken before that human had what Nussbaum describes in part as the capability to live with and toward others, to recognize and show concern for other humans, to engage in various forms of social interaction, to be able to imagine the situation of another. It remains unclear why noticing that most of the humans we encounter have this capability, and even agreeing that they ought to be able to exercise it freely, would lend credence to natural human rights as rights humans have just in virtue of being human. It takes more than simply being human to have the capabilities that Nussbaum believes justify the entitlements that she outlines. But take also an arguably more basic and natural capability such as life, right? Which Nussbaum defines as being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length, not dying prematurely or before one's life is so reduced as to be not worth living. This capability too is of course filled with social content at every step. The natural biological parameters for human life are so flexible as to not tell us very much at all in any given case about the specifics of the duration and quality of life a society must provide its members. Normal lifespan, premature death, and low or intolerable quality of life are all concepts that can only be made sense of within a given social context. So here too, I think a naturalistic theory of human rights falls on one or another horn of the dilemma I outlined at the outset of this section. Make your conception of human nature too robust, and it will interfere with the desired widely cross-cultural palatability of human rights. Make it too thin, and you won't be able to explain how human nature can ground the sort of robust entitlements asserted in human rights talk. Nussbaum's argument for moving from the presence of capabilities to the existence of correlating entitlements must stand or fall on its own, neither borrowing urgency, as she calls it, or legitimacy from the Human Rights Project, nor really lending it any ethical credence. So I also have more to say about that, but I'm going to leave that thought there with having presented what I see as some of the challenges, right, and weaknesses of these approaches. So the case for just doubling down on ontology, right? So modern day human rights theory, I think, has worked itself into a tight squeeze between Scylla and Charybdis. The religious ontology that once made human rights intelligible is no longer tenable, and in any case, not such as to win broad international and cross-cultural acceptance as human rights theory must, if it is to serve its proponents' purposes. Worse, no other broadly acceptable human rights supporting ontology seems to be forthcoming. Commentators, including Rawls, Beitz, Bernard Williams, Nussbaum, Sen, and others, have attempted to address this shortfall by developing theories of human rights that depend on no particular ontological conception of human nature at all. But in accepting, or in some cases, even embracing the view that it may be impossible to say with certainty what human beings are, these authors open the door to cultural relativism, which threatens the project of formulating universal human rights in the first place. How can universalist moral claims be taken seriously in the face of such limited knowledge? Insofar as these ways of theorizing human rights accept and are hospitable to anti-essentialism about human nature, it seems the relativist raises a perfectly good question. If we are to retain a notion of objectivity and universality in moral theory, then I think we need to return to the project of developing a coherent and accurate moral ontology, not a religious one, right? And we need to jettison what cannot be squared with it. And I think that includes much human rights talk. I do not mean that we should step backwards and embrace a religious ontology once again. Rather, we need to develop a thorough historical and materialist account of essential human nature, of the relationship between the natural world and human social existence, and of the processes through which human development has occurred and can be continued. It's not enough to start and end with the bare fact of capabilities and functionings. We must also ask how it is that human beings are such as to have such capabilities and functionings, and how these have come about historically. Only in the light of such knowledge about human beings can we make accurate and universal claims about what inhibits or promotes the flourishing of beings such as these and allows them to live in accordance with that nature. So I'll say, like, I think, I've talked about human nature, but I haven't said anything. I think that the essential character of human existence is our active intervention, active, conscious, and goal-directed intervention into our natural and social environments in order to live and in order to satisfy a wide and expanding range of human needs. I think it's the labor process, our creative, productive transformation of the world in order to satisfy our needs, which in turn affects a transformation in ourselves, and that the central project of human liberation, I think, is to practice that kind of conscious, goal-directed intervention at the level of the species in a way that takes the shape of our transforming our relationships to one another, transforming our relationships to the world, so that we as a species can survive, which is a big question mark right now, right? So when I talk about a sort of essence or human nature, this is what I mean. But importantly, what I just described is a processual, historical, developing, ongoing dynamism, right? It's not the sort of thing that is particularly amenable to being glossed as a set of eternal, fixed rights that people have just in virtue of their biology, right? They have the of being Homo sapiens, right? They have it as part of a communal, social, collective co-production of our lives. And that is something that I mean, in my book, in Marx's Ethical Vision, I say towards the end that philosophy can represent these problems. It can kind of give us the contours and outlines of the problems, but the project of coming to some shared understanding of our lives together is not a purely philosophical problem, right? It's not, I don't think that's something that philosophy alone can solve. It's something that has to actually be made. and made through struggle, made through solidarity, right? Made through creating connections among all of the people of the world who want to live, right? And figuring out how that can be done in a way that actually furthers that aim. And Guantanamo Bay is not that. Genocide in Gaza is not that. However much it might be justified, rhetorically, by appeal to the right to live, right? It won't actually be successful, right? I mean, it's not even a good plan for what it's attempting to do, right? And so what we need is an alternate vision. So I just got all worked up and now I'm like, where am I? So to concede that such ontological questions may be unanswerable about what we are as human beings, I think really is also to concede that a genuine universal morality cannot be established. I think ontology and morality are intimately connected, and that it's not possible to say what's good for human beings without also saying and knowing what kind of beings they are. Nussbaum suggests that I don't mean to pick on Nussbaum. I just think she's really good, and so that's why she, so Nussbaum suggests that attempting to produce a society in which human beings actually do function in ways that are determined valuable by a moral theory can only be a kind of authoritarianism that undermines personal choice and freedom. I see no reason why this should be true. And it is certainly not the case, as Nussbaum claims it is, for Marxism. I think the actual phrase she uses is Marxist Aristotelianism, which is just Marxism. That's what Marxism is. There's no other, anyway, sorry, that's one of my more punchier takes. There's no other Marxism. I do not have the space here to attempt a full exposition of Marx's moral thought. I already did that. I did that elsewhere, right? However, I will say that while it is certainly true that according to Marx, the highest goal for human beings is to produce a society in which all humans actually do function in accordance with their essence as natural and social beings who produce their existence socially through the labor process, that is in no way in conflict with human freedom. To function in this way is precisely for a person to realize her capacity to intervene consciously, rationally, and purposively into the external world, into social relations, and into her own life. It is the realization of genuine human freedom. Marx refers to this as the life of a rich individual or a social individual, a person who experiences the pursuit of her own development as an inner need, engaging in a broad array of human activities. The goal there is not to force individuals into some preordained set of valuable activities, but rather to produce a society in which the potential of human beings to engage in a wide, diverse, and expanding range of activities in ways that are directed by their own interests and personalities is realized. To produce a world in which human beings function in accordance with their nature, then, would not artificially limit, but rather radically expand the sphere of free individual and social action for human beings. Liberal critics of Marxism attack a straw man when they suggest that human rights talk is needed, whatever its theoretical weaknesses, because it is somehow all that stands between freedom and paternalistic authoritarianism. So I want to conclude now. So cultural relativist critiques of human rights, I think, actually pose a real challenge to the theory. And what's interesting is that this is, I think, denied. Most of the people doing this work just think, well, relativism is clearly wrong, so we don't have to worry about it, right? But then if it's clearly wrong, I think it's alarming that they don't have better arguments against it, right? So I think that challenge is wrongly underestimated. Although nearly every recent book propounding a theory of human rights devotes some time and attention to the project of debunking relativism, if we look at those attempts with clear eyes, it becomes apparent they do not actually put it to rest. It matters that the arguments human rights theorists typically make against cultural relativism are not decisive. And I've argued here that the explanation for human rights theory's weakness in this regard is that contemporary human rights theory has divorced itself from the kind of ontological conception of essential human nature and grounding of morality in that nature that can provide the only possible basis for a decisive argument against it. To actually set about the project of constructing an accurate and scientific moral ontology would undermine human rights, because to do so would leave no room for the idea that human beings have pre-social and ahistorical claims just in virtue of their species membership. Yet, the pragmatism that human rights theorists have turned to as an alternative to that ontology is also no friend to moral universalism, because it seeks to justify the use of human rights talk in terms of its expediency without actually establishing its truth or genuine validity for all human beings. This disconnect between morality and a materialist scientific account of human beings and the world in which they exist has enabled the use of human rights as a tool to legitimate and justify a whole host of irrational and destructive military interventions around the world, and continues to do so. Although human rights talk played a crucial role as part of the guiding ideology for such progressive historical processes as the French and even the American Revolution, we have that discussion there, but it is now time to move beyond it, I think, and turn to the project of developing a genuinely naturalistic moral philosophy that demonstrates the connection between human existence as it is and human existence as it ought to be, as well as a political practice commensurate with that conception. And I lastly want to add a coda of sorts, right? Because I think another risk that I haven't enumerated yet is that sort of shrinking back from the attempt to say what human beings are, and to have a view that is totally indifferent to whatever it is that people might want to fill in the blank with, is that it lends itself really easily to claims about what a human being is not. This Gazan looks like a human, actually an animal, right? This Black person, right? This prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. I think that, I mean, this is one of my, this is speculative for me now, but I think, I just think that it lends itself theoretically very readily to this kind of dehumanization, actually, that it has this like contradictory sort of effect, that when you empty that concept of the human out of any content, it becomes really easily used for dehumanization. And my evidence for that is, look around, like we see it. So that's the sort of addendum there, but thank you so much for your attention. As I say, these are things that I've had percolating for a while, and recent events, of course, have me looking at it with particular attention and distress. So I need your help, like sort of thinking about these things. I really look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
So I have a question about the approach to trying to understand, we want to understand what a human being is before we try to make moral claims about whether or not they have these rights. Seems like the best way to do that, it seems like you're saying there's, a scientific approach to it, empirical approach to it. It seems like there's also a historical approach to it. So I'm wondering if you're suggesting that philosophers should be teaming up with anthropologists more. The anthropologist seems
Oh,
to
that would
be
be great.
studying, seems to
Yeah.
be studying the human being, but not making moral claims about it or trying to make any kind of applied theories towards what to do with human beings. So is that maybe possibly something we can pull from this? Is this
Yes.
interfield work?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm also going to say something spookier now, which is that we that even whatever we can gather this sort of abstract principle or claim, right, that I enumerated, that the essential activity of human being is our activity of making ourselves, which we do through this creative productive labor, this activity of labor. But also, so far, what we have made of ourselves is like kind of a mess. And so there's still, at right now, a kind of limitation, right, in our capacity to truly have, in terms of not just abstract form, but actually content, to sort of fill that form with the kind of understanding of the human that we might have if we weren't constantly beating and killing and oppressing one another, right? So I also want to yes, yes, we should talk to everybody. Philosophers don't talk to anthropologists or historians nearly enough, but I also don't think that even that at this moment would give you the full kind of picture of what human beings are, but we should be engaged in that project. That is, I think that's not just the project of theory, but also the project of activism as well, right? The project of like seeing our world as something that we can transform in such a way as to answer these questions about what do you need, right? Like, what do I need? What do like that's something that we're not quite in a position to fully answer, but the process of attempting to find out, I think, is what we should be up to, and that partially happens through actual activism. Yeah.
Thank you so much for such a rich talk.
Oh, thanks.
I guess I wanted to hone in on the threat that you see of the cultural relativism,
Mhm.
because I've always thought that the cultural relativist was in a really tough position, like
Mhm.
always in danger of doing a performative contradiction.
Right. Yeah.
So, insofar as the cultural relativist says, or the anthropologist and says, Western human rights regimes shouldn't, try to enforce those human rights across cultural borders, then they're saying, where do they stand in making that claim, right? They're
Mhm.
saying the West ought not to do this because of
Mhm.
cultural, and that
Mhm.
seems to be like you're occupying a transcultural universal space right there.
Mhm.
So, I don't know. It seems like the cultural relativist, insofar as he or she wants to make a claim, just can't make those claims. And
Mhm.
so I guess I'm worried that maybe you're giving the cultural relativist position a little too much weight.
Yeah, I worry about this too. Because I've had this raised to me before. I mean, my thought is that they might be in a tough spot, but they sort of deftly pull the the sort of contemporary human rights discourse down with them right into that spot. That I mean, the thing that I see as the worrying challenge. So let me just like present in sort of like in broad strokes, right? So, okay, so most human rights theorists agree we have no shared ontological conception of the human being that could justify these rights. They also then say, well, we need the rights anyway, and then there's these different attempts to sort of make that happen, right? But I think the attempts to make it happen without the ontological basis are just like not, they become just sheer chess playing, right? I mean, and in the longer paper draft, I do say that people should still go before the UN and say, hey, my human rights got violated. So I'm not saying that, right? Like if some imperialist state comes and harms you, you should make use of the redress that's available. But it becomes just that, right? It becomes just a kind of like a move that you can make in a legal game. And that can get you so far, right? But it starts to look less like a human right and more like a chess game then. And so then my thought is, well, if that is problematic, then that just leaves the other way of defending human rights, which is largely considered a non-starter by the practitioners of human rights. And then that's the thing that then has you in the relativists like wheelhouse, where they're saying, well, if you also agree that there is no shared ontological fact of the matter about what human beings are, then what justifies anything that you're saying? And yeah, you could be Rorty and say nothing. However, this is just better. I just flat-footedly say it's better. But it just seems to me, I mean, I absolutely take your point, and am bothered by it. I don't mean this answer to suggest that I'm like confident, but it just seems to me that they are that the sort of like relativist position has its drawbacks clearly, but not drawbacks that actually imperil the challenge that it's facing to human rights discourse. This is my thought. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I might be wrong. I don't know. But this is yeah.
So it seems like the peril is the peril for the human rights discourse that's posed by the cultural relativists is that people just don't pay attention to the fact that the cultural relativists are contradicting themselves.
I mean, let's put it this way: forget the relativist. You still have the same problem, right? You still have the same justification problem, where on the one hand, you say there is no shared ontological human nature, and so okay, if we don't have that, then what do we have? And we have these other things that seem like not good substitutes. So like that's sort of the sort of original kind of groundedness of human rights in a very specific and robust kind of ontology, then is followed by attempts to get back what was originally there but is no more. And I think that if we correctly move from that kind of religious ontological foundation and say, well, okay, well, we still need ontology. I think the correct social ontology and moral ontology is Marxist, and what you're going to yield is not a set of rights that have the form of the Declaration of Human Rights, for example. It will still like support all kinds of good things, but it won't have that particular form. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. It was great to follow all the nuances. I guess I have a two-part question. I mean, the problem with views attributing, human nature to people is, for example, the idea that humans are by nature productive was characteristic of a capitalist period of development, and Martha Nussbaum herself lists in the capabilities, one of them is strong separateness, which is hardly transcultural. So this is the issue of ideology. And to some degree that I don't quite know what your response is going to be as to why your view isn't in some sense ideological, therefore.
It is.
Right. Well, there's an alternative, which is, So I'm kind of wondering why you want to call it an essentialism. I think Marx, although he read Aristotle carefully and was Aristotelian in regard to the conditions, natural and social, of human life, he introduced a much more open conception of freedom, the free development of individuals as an end in itself. And that suggests a kind of alternative that is a very open idea of what humans are capable of, with the idea, in fact, that they do need to interact with nature and develop socially, which sets certain conditions that themselves are capable of interpretation as human rights, potentially as responsive to these needs. But it's kind of anti-essentialist in the sense that there isn't any kind of list of capabilities or capacities or purposes. And that's actually the approach I argue for. But I'm just wondering why you want to call it, you know, a form of essentialism, and then the question of ideology. Because I think any kind of claim people are like this is going to be limited to a reflection on our own times to some degree, or at least we have to be self-critical about that.
Yeah. So I'll start with the second question about essence and human nature, because as you're describing the details, right, of how you're presenting Marx, I agree, right? So I agree that Marx obviously, right, doesn't have sort of like a human is this, right? But he and Engels do say that, you know, of course, that line in the Critique of the German Ideology, you know, human beings can be distinguished in this way, that way, or the other, but they distinguish themselves in their interaction with the world in order to satisfy their needs. And so it doesn't have the form of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions that an organism must meet in order for it to be called a human being. What it instead is doing is to capture a developing process of human life on the planet, and to say that this process, this whole story of historical development, that is what it is to be human, right? And that human beings are human beings. I mean, another way to put this is that what is distinctive for Marx about humans is just precisely that human beings are capable of this kind of rational and conscious self-changing, right? He calls labor self-changing in capital. And so one kind of pushback that I get is like, well, Vanessa, it sounds like you just described all intentional action of any type whatsoever, right? And that this is extremely thin as the sort of claim about human beings that could give rise to ethical claims. But only some things are such as to promote the continuation of that process, and other things are such as to end it abruptly, right? You know, and I take it that this is, you know, this sort of point is the normative upshot of what is what might seem like a very thin conception of human nature. The reason now I could. Of course, I could just call it something else because it's, you know, it's quite different from what we often think of as a human essence or human nature. But I don't, because I think it enters into philosophical conversation in the same way, that it plays the same role as of grounding these claims about what ought to be and some claims about what human beings are. And so for that reason, I think it's helpful to continue to speak of it as human nature. Oh, and then another question, ideology. Yeah. So I make no claim not to be ideological, but I think so. I understand ideology as a non-pejorative concept. I don't think that ideology is necessarily necessarily obscuring or necessarily illuminating, obviously. But so the specific example that you gave, if I recall it correctly, was the notion of production as being so central to humanity. I'm sorry. Yeah, that this only comes about with capitalism. I mean, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But the sort of correctness of it will stand or fall on how well it serves the purpose of explaining the history of human social development over time, right? And so it depends on how far we can get by looking at societies around the world and over a long period of time, by asking the question, how is it that this feature of that society is something that the people in this society have made, right? Like, how is it that they have produced these conditions or produced these institutions? And so it's not a question that I think I can answer sort of in advance, right? It's the sort of thing that has to be borne out in some way by good and satisfactory explanations of how various features of human life come to be. Well, wrongly, I think, right? You know, yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I can say more about, or yeah.
Cool, thanks. Hi, my name is Patricia. I really appreciate the talk and especially the grounding in the current devastating situation and just the bankruptcy of human rights discourse and how it's applied. So thank you for bringing us to Earth.
Yeah, right.
I have a question that's kind of related to these two. And it's not about essentialism, but about the use of objectivity and universalism, which you endorse. And I get the reasons for endorsing it. And I think the vision that you sketched of like Marx's understanding of species being and what humanity is as this creative process of that's conscious and like projecting itself onto the world has that objective quality to it, but it does not necessarily imply transhistoricity in every respect. And usually the idea of objectivity or universality is thought in philosophy circles today to imply transhistoricity. And you kind of evaded that by saying it's like it's a process that happens over time. But I think it's important to note that because it's not from that transhistorical process, we don't get a transhistorical ethics or vision of what it is to live a good life. And related to that, I think I wanted to offer maybe the fact of globalization under current capitalist regime and the legacy of colonialism and everything that's happened as that being sort of the basis for potentially like transcultural basis in a given time of an ethics. So I'm just basically wanting to like ask you to clarify a little bit about the relation between these concepts of objectivity, universality, transhistoricity, and transculturalism that seem to apply like at different levels of the view. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. So I'll just start talking and you let me know if I'm addressing the things that you're drawing out. But so I totally agree that that there can be ethical claims that come to be true, right? You know, like in particular moments. And I even think, I talk about this in my book, I even think that we can talk about the historicity of morality, period, right? Such that morality as an attempt to theorize a gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be can be abolished by making the world as it should be, right? So the sort of historicity of these notions is central to my view, actually. Your point about globalization, I just agree. I mean, Marx says right in the manifesto, right, talks about the ways that globalization can tend toward the production of a kind of global community, right? The transmission of values and of ways of interacting and of seeing one another. And of course, we also see the flip side, right? You know, sort of negative version of that with issues of imperialism and so on. But I mean, so is the question essentially, do I want to make space for the possibility of ethical claims that are objective but not transhistorical, that are true now, but yeah. Yeah, I think my answer is yes, right? It's yes, because I mean, because of you know, I mean, so this is like a way of saying that local conditions will matter, right? To what it is that one ought to do in a particular case. I mean, is that an unfair? I mean, like that's, I mean, which they would, right? You know, yeah. But yeah. I mean, so it's helpful maybe to say like, so I have a, I think so first of all, I think there's lots of things that we impute moral weight to that are strictly speaking, not actually moral questions. So I think, you know, like, so there's nothing in my book that will like help anybody decide in their own personal case whether or not to lie about why they were late or something, you know, like, or whether like there's all sorts of like moral questions that philosophers spend a lot of time worrying about that I just like I just don't think actually have significant kind of moral status. The thing that I think is ethically demanded of, well, the thing that I think ethics says about what we should do, how we should interact with one another, I think that we should strive to promote our flourishing as human beings. We should strive to create those conditions in which we can have a proliferation of powers and we can express ourselves in all kinds of different and creative ways. And what exactly is needed in any given circumstance, or what kinds of capacities and capabilities and talents and interests that people have, is all going to be very much locally and culturally determined. So I think, so that's a long way of coming back to my initial answer, which was yes, you know, I just think that that's right. And that the sort of, or another way to put it is that the sort of like the objectivity of the ethical claims that I'm making are going to be totally consistent with them being true everywhere. I mean, here's a claim. I don't think it's true anywhere that it's okay to stymie, limit, stifle, right, contain people from growing and developing. So that's the big objective universal claim that I just don't think is cool like anywhere, but what form that might take is going to be very different in different circumstances.
Thanks very much for the talk. I had just a kind of big picture question about how the very beginning of the talk fit with the more narrowly philosophical part of the talk. So as the beginning of the talk went, you called out the obvious hypocrisy in some a nation like the United States that purports to be a champion of human rights, having established Guantanamo and then aiding, abetting this gross violation of human rights in Gaza currently, and so on. So there's no question about that. So we've got that as part of the bankruptcy background that Patricia just referred to. Then we proceeded to a philosophical discussion about the ontological foundation of human rights. And you didn't say this exactly, I don't think, but I was sort of expecting that something about the difficulties we get in providing that foundation is somehow partly causally responsible for the kinds of atrocious violations of, or hypocritical violations we have of human rights in the background conditions. And so that the kind of, what I took as an implication, but perhaps this is not what you wanted to imply, was that, well, had we a really solid ontological foundation for human rights, or had we gotten a better account of the human essence, maybe along the lines that you were suggesting, rather than these other, the views that you criticized, then there wouldn't be things like these atrocities.
Oh, I see, yeah.
I mean, that was a sort of, otherwise I wasn't sure what they
Right.
were doing together.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that question, because it lets me clarify something. So I do not want to endorse the counterfactual that you just named, right? But I also think it is no accident that this discourse is used, right? That these human rights talk is used. It's not, I think it's important, so I think a lot about power, about relative force, right? And the ability to impose an order onto the world. And that, of course, is the decisive thing, right? That's what it's the materiality of force and power that not only explains the destruction and havoc being caused, but also the hegemony of that very same human rights discourse, right? And sort of like how it is promoted and used. And I think it's important to it is hypocrisy, but it also, I think, really serves a purpose in getting buy-in, in helping with the manufacture of consent, in confusing the issue for people, right? And that is an important and indispensable function of these uses of human rights discourse and of all other sorts of ideology that is used in hypocritical ways to promote terrible behavior. So it's not that, if only we, thank you so much for asking the question, because it's not that, if only we had the right theory, then this wouldn't happen. But it's because what ultimately is the issue is not just the theory, right? It's the actual relation of power. And the fact that we have this theory is itself, I think, a consequence of the relations of power being what they are, and being positioned to promote and defend theories, perspectives, and worldviews that are most congenial to it. I think that's right. And also one part that I didn't read is that this is, like everything I write, meant primarily as advice for revolutionaries, right? And so I don't take it that that they'll invite me to the UN to explain the philosophy, right? Like this isn't going to happen. But I think that for those who are really trying their best to understand the world and make it better, right? It's very tempting to adopt the exact same kind of moral landscape that these powerful nations are putting forward because human rights sound great. And there is lots of, I mean, I also don't want to be overly cynical because there is good work that some people and organizations do precisely on the basis of human rights, right? Where they are they're trying to make use of the sort of instability of the concept of human rights because it does have that potentially progressive content that Bentham was so worried about that it was going to just cause riots forever, right? It does have that, and so there's I think, you know, I think when we go before whatever court, right, and say, you know, my human rights have been violated and I want redress and I want repair, to do that with a little bit of ironic distance from the discourse, right, to understand ourselves as laying hold of a particular in a particular tool, a not particularly good one, for certain kinds of amelioration. But if the aim is to produce radically different circumstances, then we need to do exactly what it is that human rights discourse refuses to do, which is try to have a clear understanding of what human beings are and of what kind of world is most conducive to the flourishing of beings such as ourselves.
I'm going to try to squeeze 2 more questions in. We only have a couple minutes left, though. So,
Oh, thanks. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for your talk. I got particularly excited at the end when you started talking about Marx. One thing, I wonder what you think about this one thing, and Patty and Carol have already touched on what I was going to say. So we're so predictable, us three, I think. Relativism today just strikes me as a little odd, at least with specific values, because we have universal, like for better or worse, and it's both, right? Maybe. The market economy has been pretty much universalized, and that has equality and freedom as norms that are kind of essential to its functioning. Some concept of freedom and equality. So I wonder what you think about that as a response to relativism. But the other thing, when you started talking about labor, I mean, I immediately started thinking about Locke and Smith and Rousseau and Hegel. And sometimes I struggle actually to see much of a difference between Marx's humanist conception of the connection between labor, self-development, and freedom. It seems like for Marx, the problem is not so much those norms, but rather the fact that they've become self-contradictory under capitalism, that they can't be realized under conditions of industrial production. And that seems to be the problem with universal rights discourse. So, human rights discourse. So it's possible human rights already have those norms of labor and self-development, change, transformation already implicit in them. And so perhaps that's not the issue, right? That in fact it's their self-contradiction under conditions of global capitalism. And I wonder what your project would add on top of that. Would it be a sort of richer development of those norms, or would it be a normative yardstick that points towards communism, or is from the point of view of communism that you're then going to judge our current, predicament? Is that a clear question?
Let me just repeat it back and make sure I'm capturing
Yeah.
so I hear 2 worries, or maybe not worry, 2 thoughts. And one is whether we should think of whether the way to think of human rights is they're real, they exist. We just live in a society that reliably and necessarily fails to honor them. And then the other,
I would
oh,
say
sorry, yeah.
contradictory because it definitely honors them and definitely dishonors them,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
I
Okay,
would
in the
say,
same way that capitalism is just and so on.
yeah, in the same way
according to
that,
Marx, yeah.
in the same way that I'm not a peasant, so you
Mhm.
know, I can choose my profession, I can
Mhm,
develop
mhm.
myself, I have a level of freedom, right?
Yeah. And then the other thought was maybe human rights already contain a notion of diamond. So so I'll start with that one because I mean, another way, like I could have given this whole talk and framed it in a different way, and that would have been human rights will never shake off their religious sort of grounding, right? A religious grounding that is idealist, that is abstract in a problematic way. And it seems to me that I mean the initial justification is in this eternal being, right? Who just gives these rights and entitlements, and that explains why they're not really historically emergent. They're a result of a blessing or something, right? It just seems to me that human rights talk has the ahistoricism built in, built into the the whole notion, right, of you don't need to know anything about the history of this organism other than that in one story they're blessed by God, in the other story nothing at all, right? It fills that role, but you don't have to know anything about the history and circumstances of an organism of this species in order to know what it's owed. And so that just seems to me like aggressively ahistoricist. But for the first question, which I reiterated and then I've now forgotten. It was, oh, I see. Yeah, that's right. I mean, something like that. See, I mean, like, I do think something like that. I do think that we are in the process of producing and coming to know what it, but I wouldn't formulate it as rights per se. Um, uh, I, I mean, the perspective that I'm operating from, right, and attempting to represent in some way, is rights already is as is well discussed, like incorporate a kind of antagonism, a sense of demand and resist and whatever, and I work ethically from a perspective of what is it that we need, right? Like that the work that needs to be done is to produce the sort of bonds of solidarity and shared communal flourishing globally, right? To come back to the globalization question, such that the question for us then becomes not what am I entitled to, right, from you, from an institution or what have you, but rather, what do I need? What do we need? Like, how do, that sort of self-reflexive question of a society that is conscious of itself and has the capacity to intervene in the world in a way that allows it to satisfy its needs. So it would be a very different language attending to a very different sort of picture of what the collective of human beings is.
I know I said 2 more questions, but we've got to stop there. I hope people who were on the queue can come to the reception and ask you questions there. Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you so much.